What would you do if you stepped out of a hospital late at night only to find a 7-year-old girl behind the wheel of a car with her unconscious mother in the back seat? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the rest of this healing journey. The cold air of a Manhattan evening swept against Alexander Hayes as he left New York Presbyterian Hospital. The lights of the city shimmered like fractured stars against glass towers, but to Alexander they were just noise, distractions after another board meeting with surgeons and administrators. His life was built on precision, numbers, profits, outcomes. The world knew him as the CEO of Hayes Medical Group, a man of structure and strategy. Few would imagine that this night, in the small stretch of asphalt outside the hospital, something would tear through the sterile walls of his carefully constructed life. He had intended only to call his driver, head back to his penthouse on Central Park West, and prepare for another morning of negotiations. But as he crossed the plaza, his eyes caught a sight so out of place that it rooted him where he stood. A battered gray Honda Civic idled at the curb. Its paint was peeling, headlights dim, the kind of car that seemed held together more by hope than by mechanics. At first, Alexander assumed it belonged to a tired nurse or a visiting family, but then he saw movement inside. The driver's seat was far too small for the figure perched on its edge. His breath caught. A little girl, no more than 7, was clinging to the wheel with both hands, her face pale in the glow of the dashboard. Her feet barely reached the pedals. For a moment, Alexander thought it had to be some cruel joke, a child pretending. But then he noticed the back seat. A woman slumped across the torn upholstery, her head tilted unnaturally, her skin drained of color. The girl's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. Her lips moved, whispering something only she could hear. Alexander's instincts warred within him. He had spent decades negotiating with billionaires, silencing boardrooms with a glance. But nothing prepared him for this. Slowly, he stepped closer. The little girl turned sharply, her eyes wide, the kind of eyes that had seen far too much. "Please," she whispered through the half-open window. I can't wake her up." Her voice trembled but carried the clarity of desperation. She gestured weakly to the woman in the back. "It's my mom. I drove her here. She was bleeding, and she wouldn't stop." The words pierced through Alexander's composure. A child driving through New York City traffic, alone, to save her mother? It was impossible, reckless. And yet here she was. He crouched beside the car, lowering his voice as if speaking to something fragile. "What's your name?" "Lily," she said. "Lily Parker. And your mom?" "Rachel." Her eyes darted back to the unmoving figure. She told me to stay with her, but she passed out. I didn't know what else to do." Alexander felt a pressure rise in his chest. The hospital was only a few yards away, yet this girl had carried the weight of the world alone until now. "Lily, you did something incredible," he said softly. "But you don't need to hold this by yourself anymore." He signaled to a nearby orderly, his voice shifting from gentleness to command. "Get a gurney here now! Trauma unit!" Within seconds, medical staff rushed forward. The rear door opened, and Rachel Parker was lifted onto a stretcher. Lily scrambled out of the driver's seat, her small body trembling as she clung to the doorframe. Alexander reached out, steadying her shoulder. "She's in good hands now. You're safe." But Lily didn't look at him with relief. Her eyes, rimmed red from tears, searched his face with suspicion and fear. She whispered almost inaudibly, "They always say that. And then they send me away." Those words struck him harder than he expected. He didn't fully understand them yet, but they carried a story written in shadows. As the doctors wheeled Rachel inside, Alexander remained beside Lily, unwilling to step away. The girl's small hand still rested on the chipped metal of the car door, as though she feared the entire world might collapse if she let go. He knelt so that their eyes were level. "Listen to me, Lily. You're not alone tonight. Not anymore." For the first time, her grip eased. The automatic doors of the emergency wing closed behind the gurney. Alexander rose, motioning for Lily to walk with him. She followed silently, her steps echoing against the cold pavement. Inside the fluorescent glare of the hospital, orderlies scattered, nurses shouted vitals, monitors beeped like mechanical heartbeats. Rachel disappeared through the swinging doors of the ICU, swallowed by sterile light. Lily stood frozen, her small frame dwarfed by the towering walls of glass and steel. Her eyes darted between the chaos and Alexander, as if searching for an anchor. He extended his hand, not as a CEO, not as a man used to command, but as someone who, for reasons he couldn't name, couldn't bear to watch her stand alone. She hesitated, then slipped her tiny hand into his. And in that single moment, Alexander Hayes, who had built his empire on control, power, and precision, realized his life had just veered into a road no map could chart. The waiting room of the ICU was one of those liminal spaces in New York Presbyterian Hospital that seemed suspended between time zones. The clock on the wall ticked with military precision. Yet minutes stretched into hours. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee left too long on a hot plate. A vending machine hummed in the corner, offering candy bars and chips no one had the appetite to eat. Alexander Hayes had sat in countless boardrooms across Manhattan, negotiating billion-dollar mergers with men who measured time by dividends and quarterly reports. Yet he had never felt time move so slowly as he did here, watching a 7-year-old girl curl into the corner of a vinyl chair, hugging her knees to her chest. Lily Parker sat silently, her eyes fixed on the double doors that had swallowed her mother. Every time a doctor or nurse in scrubs pushed through them, her head jerked up. Each time, disappointment carved deeper lines into her small face. Alexander had tried, at first, to fill the silence with words. He offered her a bottle of water. She shook her head. He asked if she was hungry. She whispered, "No." He told her the doctors were some of the best in the country, but she only murmured, "They said that before." He stopped then, realizing that silence was the only language Lily trusted in this space. Still, his presence was not lost on her. She leaned closer to the armrest nearest him, as though some part of her, despite the distrust in her words, recognized his steadiness. The sliding doors opened, and a woman in a navy blazer with a hospital badge clipped to her lapel entered. She was in her late 30s, her dark hair pinned neatly into a bun, her leather folder pressed to her chest. Alexander recognized the look immediately. A social worker. She scanned the room and found her subject, Lily. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said softly, crouching down to meet Lily's eyes. "My name is Karen Diaz. I work with the hospital. I just want to make sure you're safe while your mom is being taken care of." Lily stiffened instantly, retreating deeper into the chair. Her arms locked tighter around her knees. Karen's voice was warm, practiced, a tone meant to soothe frightened children. "Do you have family nearby, Lily? Someone we can call to stay with you tonight?" The girl shook her head. "It's just me and Mom." Karen nodded as if she'd expected the answer. "That's okay. We have wonderful foster families in the city who can look after you just for a little while. You won't be alone." The moment the word foster was spoken, Lily's entire body reacted. She jolted forward, shaking her head furiously. "No, I'm not going back. Please, no!" Her small hands clutched the armrest as if the vinyl itself could keep her tethered to her mother. Her voice cracked into sobs. "They said last time it would only be for a week. But it was months. Months without Mom. I don't want to go." Karen's expression softened with sympathy, but her tone remained professional. "Sweetheart, I know it's scary, but it's just until your mom is well again. It's for your safety." That was when Alexander stood. His towering frame and tailored charcoal suit made him an imposing presence, but his voice came low, steady, almost protective. "She's not going anywhere tonight." Karen straightened, caught off guard. "Mr. Hayes. Alexander Hayes." The name carried weight, and Karen's eyes widened slightly. She clearly recognized it. "Mr. Hayes," she began cautiously, "I understand your concern, but hospital protocol requires—" Alexander cut her off, his voice firm but calm. "Protocol doesn't erase trauma. You saw her reaction. Removing her from here will only harm her more." Karen shifted uncomfortably. "She needs a legal guardian present. Without her mother conscious, there's no one—" "There is now," Alexander said, his eyes never leaving Lily. "She'll stay with me." The words surprised even him as they left his mouth. He hadn't planned them. They were instinct, a promise spoken before logic could catch up. Karen blinked. "That's highly irregular. We would need paperwork, background checks." "I own half the buildings on this block," Alexander replied, the steel of a boardroom negotiator slipping into his tone. "If you run my name, you'll find more background than you know what to do with. And if you need a signature, my legal team is on call 24 hours a day." Karen hesitated, torn between regulation and the undeniable presence before her. Meanwhile, Lily's eyes filled with new tears, not of fear this time, but of desperate hope. She slid off the chair and ran straight to Alexander, wrapping her small arms around his waist as if clinging to a lifeline. "Please," she begged, her face pressed against his suit. "Don't let them take me." Alexander rested one hand gently on her shoulder. He looked at Karen, his voice quiet but unyielding. "You see? She's already chosen where she feels safe." Karen exhaled slowly. She was used to battles with parents, with courts, with bureaucracy. But this was something different. She finally nodded. "I'll need you to sign temporary custody papers until her mother wakes." "Bring them," Alexander said. Lily didn't let go of him, not even when Karen left to fetch the forms. She stood rooted by his side, her face still pressed against the expensive wool of his jacket. For once, Alexander didn't mind the wrinkled fabric or the salt of her tears. The waiting room grew quiet again, but this silence felt different, less like despair, more like a fragile truce. A nurse passed by, pausing to ask if Lily wanted some hot chocolate from the cafeteria. The girl looked up briefly, then shook her head. "Not unless Mom can have some too." Alexander's chest tightened. He crouched to meet her gaze. "You know, Lily, sometimes taking care of yourself helps your mom too. She'd want you to stay strong." She studied him, her brown eyes searching for any hint of deception. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Maybe later." Hours passed. Midnight turned into dawn, the skyline outside the hospital windows bleeding from black to gray to a faint blush of morning. Karen returned with papers. Alexander signed them without hesitation, his signature bold and final, binding him to something he had never envisioned when he left his board meeting hours earlier. Lily watched every stroke of the pen. When he finished, she whispered, "Does this mean I can stay with you?" Alexander nodded. "Yes, it does." For the first time since he had seen her behind the wheel of that battered Honda, a small smile flickered across Lily's face. It was quick, uncertain, but real. She curled back into the chair beside him, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Her eyelids drooped, and soon her head tilted against his arm. Alexander shifted slightly, careful not to wake her, allowing her to rest against him. The hospital around them buzzed on, machines beeped, Doctors called codes, footsteps echoed through hallways. But in that waiting room, for a few fragile hours, there was only a silent pact between a powerful man and a small girl who had clung to hope with both hands. And though Alexander would never admit it aloud, that silence felt more sacred than any deal he had ever signed. The penthouse on Central Park West had been designed to impress. Polished marble floors stretched across wide hallways, walls lined with modern art from auctions Alexander barely remembered attending. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline like moving paintings, yellow cabs streaming like veins, the glitter of Times Square pulsing in the distance, the green shadow of Central Park sprawling below. For years, Alexander Hayes had lived here alone. The space was meant for entertaining, catered dinners, political fundraisers, board meetings with champagne. But tonight, the silence echoed differently. Tonight, he wasn't returning to emptiness. He was carrying a sleeping 7-year-old girl through the double doors of his home. Lily Parker's head rested against his shoulder, her breath soft and uneven after a day of fear and tears. She was light in his arms, frighteningly so, as though life had demanded more from her than her small frame could carry. Her hair smelled faintly of smoke and old fabric, remnants of a car that had long outlived its promise. The driver opened the door for them. Alexander gave a brief nod, then crossed the threshold. The apartment's ambient lighting flicked on automatically, casting warm tones across the living room. Lily stirred, lifting her head just enough to see the towering ceilings and the enormous sectional couch that looked more like an art installation than a place to sit. Her eyes widened. She whispered hoarsely, "It's like a hotel." Alexander lowered her onto the couch gently. "It's home," he said. Lily sat upright, folding her legs beneath her. Her gaze moved cautiously over the room, from the abstract sculpture by the fireplace to the grand piano standing unused in the corner. She hugged her small backpack to her chest, the only thing she had brought from the car. Alexander watched her, sensing the tension in her posture. For all the luxury surrounding her, Lily seemed smaller here, as though the vastness itself might swallow her whole. He crouched so their eyes met. "Would you like something to eat? Or maybe a glass of milk before bed?" She shook her head, clutching her backpack tighter. "I don't want to go back." He blinked. "Back where?" "To that house," she said quickly, her voice sharp with a child's urgency. "The one we lived in. It was always dark. The lights never worked. The walls leaked when it rained. I don't want to go back there." Her words tumbled out in a rush, as though she feared silence might give him a chance to disagree. Alexander sat back slowly. There was no manipulation in her tone, no performance. This was raw truth from a child who had lived in shadows. "You're not going back," he said firmly. Her eyes narrowed, suspicious. "People say that, and then they change their mind. Do I look like someone who changes his mind?" His lips quirked into a faint smile, but his voice carried a steel edge. Lily studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "You look like someone who makes the rules." That struck him more deeply than he expected. He had built his career on being exactly that, the one who made the rules. But here, with this girl in his penthouse, it sounded less like praise and more like a plea. "Maybe tonight," he said softly. "The rule is that you're safe." The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. He stood, loosening his tie. "Come on. Let me show you your room." He led her down a hallway where recessed lights glowed like soft lanterns. He paused at a guest bedroom, a space rarely used, its bed neatly made with crisp linens, its window framing the park below. Lily stepped inside hesitantly. She ran her fingers across the duvet, marveling at the smooth fabric. Then she looked at him, almost embarrassed. Do I really get to sleep here?" Yes, Alexander said. It's yours tonight. She placed her backpack carefully at the foot of the bed, as though claiming territory. Then she crawled onto the mattress, bouncing slightly before settling cross-legged in the middle. Alexander stood at the doorway, unsure of protocol. He had never tucked in a child before. His life had been contracts, acquisitions, deadlines, not bedtime rituals. Lily looked up at him. Aren't you supposed to say goodnight? He cleared his throat. Good night, Lily. Her gaze lingered on him, searching. What about you? Do you sleep here too? I have my own room, he replied. Do you sleep alone? The question hung in the air longer than he expected. For a child, it was innocent curiosity. For him, it was a mirror he hadn't looked into for years. Yes, he said finally. She nodded, as if filing away that piece of information. Then, softly, I don't like the dark. Without thinking, Alexander crossed the room and switched on the bedside lamp. The warm glow filled the space, chasing shadows into corners. There, he said. No darkness tonight. Lily lay down, pulling the blanket to her chin. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, staring at the ceiling. Do you think Mom's going to wake up? Alexander hesitated. His instinct was to give her certainty, to promise. But something in her eyes told him she had been lied to before. She would know if he gave her false comfort. I don't know, he admitted honestly. But the doctors are doing everything they can. And until she does, you're not alone. She studied him, then whispered, Okay. Minutes later, her breathing slowed, the rhythm of exhaustion finally overtaking her. Alexander stood silently, watching the rise and fall of her chest. He felt a weight settle in him, a responsibility he had not chosen but could not shake. He thought of Rachel Parker lying in ICU, unconscious, her life balanced on the edge of a surgeon's skill. He thought of Lily, clutching a steering wheel too big for her hands, whispering to herself in the dark. He turned off the overhead light, leaving only the bedside lamp on. Then he closed the door gently. Back in the living room, he poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid glowing under recessed lights. But when he raised it to his lips, it tasted hollow. The drink that once steadied him now felt meaningless. He set the glass down untouched. His eyes drifted to the window, to the sprawl of the city that he had conquered with relentless ambition. Yet tonight, all its lights seemed dim compared to the small lamp burning in the guest room down the hall. For the first time in years, Alexander Hayes realized that empire meant nothing if it could not protect one frightened little girl. And somewhere deep inside, a question stirred, a question he had avoided his whole life. What if all this wealth, all this power, was never meant for himself alone? The first light of morning broke across Central Park, slipping through the glass walls of the penthouse. The skyline stretched endlessly, bathed in gold and gray, but inside the kitchen the glow felt softer, more intimate. Alexander Hayes stood at the stove, sleeves of his white dress shirt rolled haphazardly to his elbows. He wasn't a man used to domestic rituals. The kitchen, with its marble counters and high-end appliances, was usually staffed by private caterers. But today, at 6 in the morning, he found himself staring down a carton of eggs as though it were a hostile takeover bid. He cracked one clumsily against the counter. Half the shell splintered into the bowl, and he muttered a curse under his breath. He fished the pieces out with a spoon, glancing over his shoulder. From the doorway, Lily Parker sat at the edge of a bar stool, her chin propped on her hands. She was still in the oversized t-shirt he had found in a storage drawer last night, her blonde hair tangled from sleep. Her expression was somewhere between suspicion and amusement as she watched the billionaire CEO struggle with breakfast. "You don't know how to cook, do you?" she asked. Alexander shot her a look, then returned to whisking the eggs as best he could. I know how to delegate. Cooking is not typically my department. Lily tilted her head, unimpressed. Mom makes scrambled eggs every morning. She says it's the one thing you can't ruin. He poured the beaten eggs into a pan that was already too hot. The mixture sizzled angrily, burning at the edges. He tried to stir, but the spatula stuck. Lily giggled, the first real laugh he had heard from her. You just ruined it. Alexander sighed, setting the spatula down. All right, you win. I'm a terrible cook. But in my defense, no one's ever given me a performance review in the kitchen before. The laughter faded into a softer smile. She looked at him, almost testing whether he would be offended. But when he smiled faintly in return, her shoulders relaxed. He slid the less-than-perfect eggs onto a plate, placing them before her with an awkward flourish. Breakfast a la Hayes. Lily poked at them with a fork. The eggs were dry, a little rubbery, but she took a bite anyway. She chewed slowly, then looked up at him. You tried. That's better than most people. The words struck him harder than expected. He leaned against the counter, watching her eat in small, careful bites. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice quieter. Mom used to say hospitals didn't like us. She said we were invisible because we didn't have the right papers. Alexander straightened. What do you mean? She was sick before, Lily said. Her stomach hurt a lot. We went to the clinic in Brooklyn, but they said they couldn't help without insurance. Mom begged. She even cried. But they said no. Her fork clinked softly against the plate. We walked home that night. She told me sometimes you have to be strong even when no one sees you. Alexander's jaw tightened. He had heard stories like this, of course. Statistics in reports, numbers in proposals. But numbers had never looked him in the eye and whispered them across a breakfast counter. Lily's gaze flicked up, sharp and direct. Why do they do that? Why do they say no when people are hurting? He took a breath, searching for the right words. Because the system isn't built to see everyone. Sometimes money and rules get in the way of compassion. Her brow furrowed. That's stupid. Yes, Alexander said softly. It is. She set her fork down, her eyes glistening. I thought maybe they just didn't like us. Something inside him cracked at that. He crouched so he was level with her. Lily, listen to me. It wasn't you. It was never about you. The system failed. Not you and not your mom. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks. He hesitated, then placed a hand gently over hers. She didn't pull away. After a long silence, she whispered, Mom said the world only cares about people like you. The words landed like a stone in his chest. For decades, Alexander Hayes had been the embodiment of exactly that, the kind of man the world cared about. Yet here, across a plate of ruined eggs, he was confronted with the cost of that truth. Maybe, he said quietly, the world needs to care about people like you too. Lily blinked, as though the possibility had never been spoken aloud before. The moment hung between them, fragile but binding. The eggs grew cold on her plate, forgotten. The city roared beyond the glass windows, but inside the kitchen the silence felt sacred. Hours later, Alexander retreated to his office in the penthouse, but his mind refused to focus on spreadsheets or conference calls. He kept hearing Lily's words. They said no. They didn't like us. He had always prided himself on efficiency, on running hospitals like finely tuned machines. But perhaps in chasing efficiency, he had overlooked the lives that fell through the cracks. He glanced at the guest room door where Lily was now curled with a sketchbook he had given her. The image of her small hands gripping the steering wheel in the dark replayed in his mind. It was then he understood. The choice before him wasn't just about guardianship or charity. It was about whether he would continue to be the man the world cared about, or become the man who cared back. That night, when Lily finished drawing, she padded softly into his study. She held up a page. It was a crayon sketch of 3 figures holding hands, her mother, and a taller figure with square shoulders. She had given him a tie and messy hair. "Is this us?" he asked gently. She shrugged, embarrassed. "I just wanted Mom to see we weren't alone." Alexander took the drawing carefully, as though it were a contract more valuable than any he had signed. He pinned it to the bulletin board above his desk, displacing stock charts and forecasts. "Thank you," he said. For the first time, she smiled without fear. Hospitals at night had a sound all their own. The daytime chorus of bustling staff, echoing voices, and rolling carts dimmed into a quieter rhythm, monitors beeping like faint heartbeats, footsteps softened by fatigue, whispers carrying more weight than shouts. Midnight was when fear felt sharpest, when sterile walls amplified every uncertainty. Alexander Hayes sat rigidly in a chair outside the intensive care unit, his suit jacket folded on his lap, tie loosened but still clinging to his neck. He had attended hundreds of midnight meetings in his life, emergency calls with investors in Tokyo, late-night strategy sessions with board members in London. Yet never had a midnight hour pressed on him like this one. Through the glass, he could see Rachel Parker lying pale and motionless on the hospital bed, tubes and monitors weaving around her like tangled threads of fate. Her chest rose faintly with the aid of machines, her face waxen under fluorescent light. She seemed caught between 2 worlds, one that demanded her departure and one that begged her to stay. Beside him, Lily sat curled in a chair too large for her small frame. Her sketchbook rested on her knees, crayons scattered across the cushion. She had drawn a shaky outline of her mother, a red heart pressed against her chest, and above it, 3 bold words: "Mom, wake up." She taped the drawing carefully to the glass of the ICU door. Nurses glanced at it as they passed, their expressions softening. Even in a place where death often lingered, the determination of a child carried its own gravity. Alexander touched Lily's shoulder gently. "That's beautiful." She shook her head. "It's not art. It's a message. So she won't forget to come back." Her words cut through him. This was not just a child's hope. It was her last line of defense against a world that had already taken too much. The door opened, and Dr. Margaret Collins stepped out. A seasoned surgeon in her late 50s, Margaret carried authority in every movement. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back, her expression calm, yet edged with urgency. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, drawing him aside. "Rachel Parker's condition has deteriorated. She's experiencing internal bleeding from a ruptured ectopic pregnancy. We need to operate immediately." Alexander's chest tightened. He had read enough medical reports in his life to know what that meant. "What are her chances?" Margaret's eyes softened, but she didn't sugarcoat. "It's high risk. She's lost a significant amount of blood. Without surgery, she won't survive the night. And with surgery? There are no guarantees, but it's her only chance." Alexander exhaled slowly, glancing back at Lily. She was watching them, suspicion carved into her small features, as though she could sense every word even if she couldn't hear it. Margaret lowered her voice. "As of now, you hold temporary custody of Lily. That includes medical decision-making authority. I need your consent to proceed." The weight of the words nearly buckled him. He had signed countless contracts, but none had ever felt like this. This wasn't about profits or risk mitigation. This was about life, about a mother and a daughter. He looked at Margaret, his voice steady. Do it. Save her. Margaret nodded once, then disappeared back into the ICU, her team already mobilizing. Alexander returned to Lily. She stared up at him, her voice trembling. What's happening? Why are they moving her? He crouched so their eyes met. For a man used to power, the act of kneeling felt foreign, but tonight it was necessary. They need to help your mom. She's very sick, and the doctors are going to do everything they can. Tears welled in her eyes. But what if they can't? He paused, then took her small hand in both of his. Then we pray, and we don't let her be alone. For the first time since they'd met, she leaned into him without hesitation, her head pressing against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling the fragility of her frame, the weight of her trust. Minutes later, the doors swung open, and Rachel was wheeled toward the operating room. Her body looked impossibly small on the stretcher, swallowed by sterile sheets and blinking machines. Lily bolted upright. "Mom!" she cried, running to the gurney. She grabbed her mother's limp hand, holding it tight until a nurse gently pulled her back. Rachel didn't stir. "Stay strong," Alexander whispered, kneeling beside Lily again. "She needs you to be strong." Together, they watched as the doors closed, leaving only the faint echo of hurried footsteps. The hours stretched into eternity. Alexander paced the waiting area, his shoes clicking against polished tile. He wasn't a man of prayer, not in the traditional sense, but tonight he found himself whispering words into the void, pleas for a woman he barely knew, promises he wasn't sure who he was making them to. Lily sat hunched in her chair, refusing to sleep. Every so often she looked at her drawing taped to the ICU door, as though sheer willpower might summon her mother back. Her lips moved silently, repeating a mantra only she could hear. "Mom, wake up. Mom, wake up." At one point she tugged Alexander's sleeve. "Can I go in there? Just for a minute?" He shook his head gently. "Not yet. The doctors need space to help her." "But she'll be scared." He swallowed hard. "Then we'll make sure she knows she's not alone, even from out here." He took out his phone, dialing his assistant to cancel all meetings indefinitely. The Empire could wait. For once, the boardrooms of Manhattan could function without him. Tonight, his place was here. At 3:47 a.m., the doors opened again. Dr. Collins emerged, her mask pulled down, exhaustion etched across her face. Alexander stood immediately. "Well?" She exhaled. "The surgery was successful. We managed to stop the bleeding and repair the damage. She's stable, but critical. The next 48 hours are vital." Relief crashed over him like a tide, but it was tempered by caution. Stable wasn't safe. Critical wasn't home. Lily rushed forward, eyes wide. "Is she awake?" Margaret crouched, meeting the girl's gaze. "Not yet, sweetheart. She needs to rest. But your mom is still with us, and that's a good thing." Lily's face crumpled with tears of relief. She turned to Alexander, clutching his hand. "She's coming back," she whispered. He squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, she is." Later, when the ICU quieted again, Alexander remained in his chair. He stared at the faint glow of monitors through the glass, at the fragile rise and fall of Rachel's chest. His thoughts drifted to Lily's words earlier. They said no. The phrase haunted him. How many Rachels had been turned away from clinics across the city? How many Lilies had whispered prayers into the dark because no one had listened? For the first time in decades, Alexander Hayes, master strategist, unflinching CEO, felt powerless. And yet, holding the small hand of a girl who refused to let go, he also felt something else, the stirrings of resolve. If Rachel survived, if Lily was to have a future, then his wealth, his influence, his empire had to mean more than quarterly reports. And as dawn broke over Manhattan, Alexander knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing in his life would ever return to the way it was. The boardroom of Hayes Medical Group was designed like a fortress of power. Polished oak walls stretched high, their sheen reflecting the chandelier's glow. The long mahogany table could seat 20 executives, each chair upholstered in deep leather, each place setting prepared with water glasses and embossed folders. This was a temple of profit, where lives were measured in numbers, and compassion was a line item debated at quarterly reviews. On this particular morning, though, the air felt combustible. Alexander Hayes entered at precisely 9 o'clock, his stride clipped, his jaw set. He carried no laptop, no prepared notes, only a slim folder and a conviction that had been forged in the fire of the previous night. For years, he had been a man who listened more than he spoke, striking only when his words carried the weight of inevitability. Today, however, his intent was different. The directors were already seated, 11 men and women, all dressed in shades of corporate gray. At the far end sat Thomas Blake, Chief Financial Officer, his silver hair slicked neatly back, his expression carrying both skepticism and a trace of smirk. Thomas had built his reputation on balancing budgets, cutting corners, and reminding Alexander of financial limits. To Thomas, compassion was a liability. "Mr. Hayes," Thomas began as Alexander took his place at the head of the table, "we weren't expecting a meeting on such short notice. I trust everything is all right?" Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. "Define all right, Thomas." The CFO shifted in his chair. "Well, the quarterly report is strong. Revenues from our private care sector are up 12%. We've successfully cut costs by reducing charity write-offs. Our investors are satisfied." Alexander let the words hang. The same statistics that had once pleased him now tasted bitter. "Yes," he said slowly, "we are profitable. But last night, I sat outside the ICU while a woman nearly died because she had been denied treatment at one of our affiliate clinics for lack of insurance." The room shifted uneasily. A few executives exchanged glances. Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped. "With respect, Alexander, we cannot save everyone. Protocol exists for a reason. If we open our doors without restrictions, the costs will—" "The costs," Alexander's voice thundered across the table, sharper than anyone had ever heard from him. "What about the cost of a child driving her unconscious mother through the streets of New York because no one else would help? What about the cost of lives lost because our balance sheets looked cleaner without them?" Silence pressed down like a weight. Some directors looked away, suddenly fascinated by the papers before them. Alexander placed his folder on the table and opened it, sliding a single-page proposal into the center. Bold letters across the top read, "The Hayes Access Initiative. This," he declared, "is our future. Effective immediately, no patient who arrives at any Hayes facility will be denied emergency treatment based on insurance status. We will create a fund, drawn from executive bonuses and non-essential capital reserves, to cover costs. And we will make it known that Hayes Medical Group stands not just for profit, but for principle." Thomas's face flushed. "You're proposing charity, at scale. Do you realize the precedent this sets? The lawsuits, the fiscal instability? Investors will riot." "Let them," Alexander said coldly. "If our investors cannot stomach saving lives, then perhaps they are not the kind of partners we need." Gasps rose from the table. No one had ever heard Alexander speak so recklessly, so passionately. Thomas slammed a hand against the wood. "This is madness. You're asking us to jeopardize decades of financial stability because of one patient." One patient. Alexander's voice cut like a blade. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Thomas. Her name is Rachel Parker, and her daughter is 7 years old. If you had been there, if you had seen her small hands gripping a steering wheel in the dead of night, you wouldn't call her one patient. You'd call her humanity. Something this board has forgotten. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to falter. Finally, Margaret Lewis, head of the Ethics Committee, cleared her throat. Alexander, I support this initiative. For years, we've spoken about corporate responsibility. This is responsibility in action. A murmur of agreement spread among a few directors. Others remained hesitant, their loyalty split between profit and principle. Thomas sneered. You're letting sentiment dictate policy. This is not who you are, Alexander. You built this empire on logic and efficiency. Alexander straightened, his voice calm but resolute. Then maybe it's time I become someone else. He tapped the folder once more. Vote now. One by one, hands rose. Hesitant at first, then firmer. The tally tipped in Alexander's favor, 7-4. The Hayes Access Initiative passed. Thomas slumped back in his chair, disbelief etched across his face. You'll regret this. No, Alexander said quietly, gathering his folder. The only regret I've carried is waiting this long. He stood, signaling the meeting's end. We are not just a company. We are a lifeline, and if that fire burns down our profits, then so be it. At least it will burn bright enough to light the way for those left in the dark. Hours later, Alexander walked through the hospital corridors again, his mind replaying the vote. For the first time in years, he felt as though the empire he had built had meaning beyond numbers. He paused at the ICU. Through the glass, Rachel remained unconscious, her chest still rising faintly with machine support. At her bedside, Lily sat drawing once more. This time her picture showed a building with open doors, stick figures walking inside, smiling. Alexander entered quietly. Lily looked up, her eyes tired but searching. Did you win? He crouched beside her, smoothing the paper she held. Yes, he said softly. We won. She tilted her head. Does that mean other moms won't get turned away? Yes, he replied, emotion thick in his voice. That's exactly what it means. She smiled faintly, then slipped her hand into his. And for the first time in years, Alexander Hayes felt that he had truly earned his place in the world. The ICU was never still. Even at dawn, when sunlight streamed faintly through the high windows, the machines never slept. Monitors blinked like tireless sentinels, pumps hissed, and alarms occasionally chirped, demanding attention. For days, Alexander Hayes had sat vigil in that sterile chamber, his presence both protective and restless. Beside him, Lily kept her own vigil, smaller and quieter, but just as fierce. She would draw pictures, hearts, houses, and stick figures with long arms reaching toward each other, and tape them on the wall above the hospital bed. Nurses began to pause each shift to look at them, softening their hurried steps. 5 days had passed since the surgery. 5 long days of waiting, of whispered prayers from a man who had never prayed, of a little girl refusing to leave her mother's side. And then, on the morning of the 5th day, something shifted. Rachel Parker's fingers twitched. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. But Lily gasped, her small hand flying to her mouth. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Alexander leaned forward, eyes fixed on the fragile stirrings. He had seen countless medical recoveries in reports, but nothing compared to witnessing life claw its way back. Rachel's eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, as though the light of the world weighed heavy on them. Her gaze was unfocused at first, swimming against the haze of sedation. But when her eyes finally landed on Lily, the faintest trace of recognition sparked. "Mom!" Lily cried, scrambling onto the chair, clutching her mother's hand with both of hers. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "You came back! You came back!" Rachel's lips parted, her voice hoarse, almost a whisper. "Lily." Alexander pressed the call button, and within moments, Dr. Collins and 2 nurses entered, checking vitals, adjusting machines, speaking in practiced tones. But Rachel's eyes never left her daughter. Once the medical team confirmed her stability, they left the room, promising to return in an hour. Silence settled, broken only by the steady rhythm of the monitors. Rachel shifted her gaze from Lily to the tall figure standing quietly at the foot of her bed. Her brow furrowed faintly. "Phew," she rasped. "Why? Why are you here?" Alexander moved closer, his voice low, steady. "Because your daughter needed someone, and because you needed someone too." Rachel swallowed, her throat dry. "You're Alexander Hayes. I've seen your face on billboards. CEOs don't sit in ICU waiting rooms for people like me." Her words carried both suspicion and disbelief. Years of struggle had taught her not to trust easily. Alexander held her gaze. Maybe they should. Lily looked between them, sensing the tension. "He stayed with me, Mom. Every night. He made me eggs even though they were really bad." Rachel managed a faint, incredulous smile. "He cooked?" "Sort of," Lily said, giggling through tears. Rachel's eyes softened, but she turned back to Alexander, her tone sharpening. "Why? Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us." He hesitated, the weight of her question pressing into him. He had asked himself the same thing countless times these past days. Why had he stayed? Why had he taken responsibility for a child he had met in such impossible circumstances? Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but unflinching. "Because when I walked out of this hospital that night, I saw your daughter behind the wheel of a car, trying to save your life with everything she had. And I realized that if someone that small could carry so much, then a man like me had no excuse not to." Rachel's breath caught. She turned to Lily, stroking her hair with trembling fingers. "You drove? Oh, my brave girl." "I had to," Lily whispered, pressing her cheek against her mother's hand. "They wouldn't help us before. I was scared they'd say no again. But then he came." She glanced at Alexander. Rachel studied him, her eyes sharp despite her weakness. "You helped her, but what do you want in return? Men like you always want something." Alexander didn't flinch. "What I want is for your daughter to never feel invisible again." The words hung heavy in the sterile air. Rachel blinked, as though unsure if she could believe them. Lily, sensing her mother's doubt, spoke up fiercely. "He means it, Mom. He even made the hospital people promise to help everyone, not just the ones with money." Rachel's gaze snapped back to Alexander. "Is that true?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Yesterday, the board voted. No one will be turned away again." "Not in any facility with my name on it." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. She turned her face slightly, ashamed. "Do you know how many times I begged for help? Do you know what it's like to be told no so often that you stop asking?" "I do now," Alexander said quietly. The monitors beeped steadily, filling the silence that followed. Finally, Rachel whispered, "I don't know if I can trust you." "I don't expect you to," Alexander admitted. "Trust isn't built in a week, but I intend to earn it." one choice at a time. Lily squeezed her mother's hand tightly. He already kept me safe, Mom. Maybe we can let him try. Rachel closed her eyes, overwhelmed. For the first time in years, she wasn't fighting alone. Alexander stood, straightening his shoulders. Rest now. You need your strength. Lily and I will be here when you wake again. Rachel opened her eyes slowly, her gaze lingering on him. There was no gratitude yet, no acceptance, but there was something new, a flicker of possibility. As he stepped back, Lily whispered something only her mother could hear. I think he's on our side. Rachel's lips parted in the faintest of smiles. And for Alexander, that was enough. For now. The days that followed Rachel's awakening unfolded like the first tentative notes of a song, hesitant, uneven, but carrying the promise of melody. Rachel was transferred from the ICU to a private recovery suite in the upper wing of New York Presbyterian. And it wasn't luxury in the traditional sense, no gilded chandeliers or designer furnishings, but it was quiet, sunlit, and safe. For Rachel Parker, who had lived years in dim apartments with leaking ceilings, the simple fact of fresh sheets and clean air felt like another world. Every morning, physical therapists arrived, guiding her through the slow work of healing. Her body, fragile after surgery and blood loss, resisted at first. Standing was a battle, walking a victory. Yet each step was witnessed by Lily, whose cheers filled the hallways like trumpets in a cathedral. Alexander was there too, not as a CEO delegating tasks, but as a man present in small, unremarkable ways, fetching water, straightening pillows, taking notes during medical rounds. He surprised himself with the patience he found, a patience he had never afforded his board or his empire. One afternoon, as sunlight pooled across the windowsill, Rachel looked at him from her bed, her voice steady though still weak. You don't have to stay. Alexander glanced up from his tablet. I know. Then why do you? He set the tablet down, considering. Because I've spent my life surrounded by people who only show up when it benefits them. I'm tired of being that kind of person. Her eyes searched his face as though testing whether his words carried weight. Lily, sitting cross-legged on the floor with crayons, broke the tension. He's telling the truth, Mom. He even learned to make toast without burning it. Rachel chuckled faintly, the sound fragile but real. That's an achievement. When Rachel was discharged 2 weeks later, Alexander arranged for a rehabilitation apartment on the Upper West Side. It was close enough for her medical team to visit daily, yet filled with light and space for Lily to thrive. The walls were painted soft cream, the windows opening onto treetops that shifted with the wind. Rachel hesitated as she stepped inside for the first time. Her hands lingered on the doorframe, as if afraid the moment might dissolve. It's too much, she whispered. We don't belong in places like this. Alexander shook his head. You belong anywhere your daughter can laugh freely, and you can heal without fear. For Lily, the apartment became a kingdom. She claimed a corner of the living room as her art studio, taping her drawings in neat rows along the wall. At night, she would curl against her mother's side, whispering stories she made up, each one ending with the same refrain. And then they never left. School was the next step. Alexander enrolled Lily in a small private academy on the Upper West Side. Unlike the towering prep schools of the wealthy, this place was intimate, with only a few dozen children in each grade. The teachers focused not only on academics, but on creativity and kindness. On her first day, Lily clutched Rachel's hand nervously at the gates. What if they don't like me? She whispered. Alexander crouched to meet her eyes. Then they're missing out. But I think you'll find that when you show them who you are, they won't just like you. They'll admire you. Lily considered his words, then squared her small shoulders. She kissed her mother's cheek, hugged Alexander briefly, something she had started doing without hesitation, and marched into the building with her backpack bouncing. Rachel watched her go, tears shining in her eyes. She hasn't had a normal school day in almost a year. I was working too many jobs, moving too often. She deserves this. She deserves more than this, Alexander said quietly. She deserves stability, and she'll have it. But stability was never truly private. Within weeks, whispers reached the press. Photographers began staking out the hospital, then the school. Headlines spread through New York tabloids. Billionaire CEO seen escorting unknown woman and child. A new family? Alexander Hayes funds secret initiative. Who are the beneficiaries? When the first article hit the New York Times, Alexander's communications director called in a panic. "We can't control the narrative, Alex. People are asking questions. Who she is, why you've taken her in. Do you want us to shut this down?" Alexander thought of Lily's tiny hand gripping the steering wheel, of Rachel whispering in her hospital bed, "I don't know if I can trust you." "No," he said firmly. "We don't shut it down. We tell the truth. For once, we tell the truth." That evening, he sat with Rachel at the dining table. "Reporters are going to keep asking. They'll speculate, and it won't be kind. We can stay silent, or we can speak." Rachel's fingers tightened around her glass of water. "I don't want Lily dragged through this. She's just a child." "I'll protect her," Alexander promised. "But the world deserves to know why she matters, why you matter. And maybe, just maybe, it will change how they see everyone else like you." Rachel studied him, torn between fear and the faint stirrings of belief. The following week, Alexander called a press conference. In the grand lobby of Hayes Medical Group headquarters, cameras flashed, journalists jostled for position. Alexander stood at the podium, his suit perfectly tailored, his voice resonant, but today he didn't speak of profits or expansion. "5 weeks ago," he began, "I met a little girl in front of New York Presbyterian Hospital. She was behind the wheel of a car trying to save her mother's life. Her name is Lily Parker. Her courage forced me to face a truth I had ignored for too long, that too many lives are left behind because they cannot afford care." He paused, letting the silence settle. "That ends now. The Hayes Access Initiative will ensure no one is turned away. Not in my hospitals. Not ever again." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few reporters exchanged glances. This was no ordinary corporate announcement. "And, to those who ask why," Alexander continued, "the answer is simple. Because I saw humanity in a child who refused to give up. And because wealth without compassion is nothing more than a prison." The cameras exploded with flashes. In the apartment, Rachel watched the broadcast with tears streaking her cheeks. Beside her, Lily beamed, her small chest swelling with pride. "He said my name," she whispered. "He told the world." Rachel pulled her daughter close, whispering into her hair. "Yes, baby, he did." That night, Alexander returned to the apartment. Lily ran to him immediately, waving a crayon-streaked page. It was a drawing of 3 figures again, this time standing under the words she had written carefully. "Family is who shows up." He took the page, his throat tightening. "That's beautiful, Lily." Rachel watched him, her gaze softer than before. For the first time, she didn't look at him with suspicion. Instead, she looked at him as though she saw not a billionaire, but a man who had chosen to stay. And in that fragile silence, a new rhythm began to take root. A rhythm of shared mornings, school runs, therapy sessions, and quiet dinners where laughter slowly replaced fear. The city outside still roared with judgment and speculation. But inside those walls, something different was being built. Not an empire of marble and steel, but the quiet foundation of a family. New York City Hall was alive with anticipation. The marble steps outside glistened from a morning rain, and beyond the security gates, the grand chamber echoed with the shuffle of polished shoes, murmurs of invited guests, and the clicking of cameras. Inside, banners of the city's seal hung above the dais, and rows of chairs had been arranged facing a podium. Reporters clustered at the back, their lenses trained forward. This was not the unveiling of legislation or the celebration of a new skyscraper. It was something rarer, the honoring of a child. Lily Parker sat between her mother and Alexander Hayes in the second row, her feet dangling inches above the ground. She wore a simple navy blue dress that Rachel had chosen carefully, smoothing the wrinkles that morning with trembling hands. Around Lily's neck hung a silver chain, a gift from Alexander. Nothing extravagant, just a small pendant shaped like a star. Rachel squeezed her daughter's hand. "Are you nervous?" Lily nodded quickly. "What if I mess up when they ask me to talk?" Alexander leaned down, his voice steady but kind. Bravery isn't about never being scared. It's about speaking even when your voice shakes. And Lily, you've already done the bravest thing anyone could ask. The mayor stepped to the podium, a tall man in a navy suit with a voice trained for speeches. The crowd hushed. "Today," he began, "we gather not to honor wealth or power, but courage. Courage that comes in the smallest of packages, and yet carries the weight of giants. A child who, when faced with a moment of despair, chose action instead of fear. Who drove her mother through the night streets of Manhattan to save her life. And in doing so, reminded us all of the humanity we too often forget." He gestured toward Lily. "Miss Lily Parker, would you join me?" A murmur of awe spread as Lily stood. Her legs shook slightly, but she walked forward, guided by the applause that rose around her. Rachel clutched her chest, tears spilling freely. Alexander stood as well, not to follow her, but to be a silent pillar behind her, his pride more profound than any business accolade he had ever received. At the dais, the mayor bent down, pinning a small bronze medal onto Lily's dress. The inscription read, "For bravery beyond measure." The applause swelled again, echoing through the chamber. Cameras flashed, capturing her wide eyes and trembling smile. The mayor handed her the microphone. "Lily, would you like to say something?" She froze, staring out at the sea of faces. For a heartbeat, silence pressed heavy. Then she looked down at the medal, her small fingers brushing against it. She turned her head slightly, finding Alexander's eyes in the crowd. He gave her a subtle nod, the same steady reassurance he'd given her since that night outside the hospital. Lily lifted the microphone, her voice quivering at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I don't feel brave," she began. "I just did what I had to do. My mom needed me, and no one else was there. I thought maybe the world had forgotten about us. But then—" She paused, her gaze drifting to Alexander again. "Then someone showed up. Someone who didn't leave." The room held its breath. Lily continued, her voice steadier now. "I want to say thank you to the doctors who saved my mom. Thank you to my mom for teaching me to be strong. And thank you to Mr. Hayes for listening when no one else did." She lowered the microphone slightly, then added with the simplicity of a child who saw the truth clearly, "Bravery is easier when someone holds your hand." The chamber erupted in applause. Even hardened reporters wiped at their eyes. Rachel wept openly, pressing her face into her hands. Alexander sat frozen, his heart pounding, the words carving into him with the weight of a vow. He had spent decades building an empire of steel and marble, but nothing had ever felt as monumental as this moment. A child naming him not for his wealth but for his presence. When Lily returned to her seat, the applause still echoing, she crawled into her mother's lap. Rachel kissed her forehead, whispering through tears, "You were perfect." Lily turned to Alexander and gave him the smallest smile. "Did I do okay?" He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You did more than okay. You reminded this city what courage looks like." After the ceremony, the three of them stepped onto the marble steps of City Hall. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks, reporters shouting questions. "Mr. Hayes, is this your adopted daughter?" "Rachel, how does it feel to see your child honored?" "Lily, what's next for you?" Security cleared a path, but Alexander paused, raising his hand. For once, he didn't run from the press. He faced them, with Rachel on one side and Lily's small hand clutching his on the other. "This," he said firmly, "is not just their story. It's our responsibility. Lily Parker should never have had to carry the burden she did. No child should. And from this day forward, Hayes Medical Group will fight to ensure that every Lily, every Rachel, has a place where the answer is never no." The cameras roared, capturing the image of a billionaire CEO not standing alone, but as part of a trio, a man, a woman, and a child who had found one another through crisis. That evening, back at the Upper West Side apartment, the metal still gleamed against Lily's dress. She refused to take it off, even as she curled on the couch between her mother and Alexander. Rachel traced the metal lightly, her voice soft. "You've changed everything, baby. Do you know that?" Lily yawned, leaning against both of them. "I just wanted you to wake up, Mom. And now—" She looked at Alexander with half-closed eyes. "Now we're not alone anymore." Rachel's eyes lifted to Alexander's. For the first time, there was no suspicion, no guarded distance. There was gratitude. There was trust. And in that small apartment, as the city outside pulsed with its usual chaos, a medal rested against a child's chest, not just a symbol of bravery, but of the family being forged in its light. Spring arrived in Central Park quietly, almost shyly, as if testing whether the city was ready to soften after months of gray. The branches bloomed with tender pink blossoms, joggers returned to the paths, and families filled the lawns with laughter. For the first time in years, Alexander Hayes found himself among them, not as a man rushing past in a chauffeured car, but as someone walking slowly, hands free, his stride unburdened. On either side of him were Rachel Parker and her daughter, Lily. Rachel still carried traces of fragility from her surgery, but the color had returned to her cheeks. Each step she took across the grass felt like a defiance of fate, a small victory over everything that had nearly claimed her. She wore a simple sundress and carried a tote filled with Lily's crayons and sketch pads. Lily bounded ahead, her medal of bravery tucked into the pocket of her jacket. She darted between benches and trees, laughter trailing behind her like music. Every so often she stopped to collect dandelions, presenting them like treasures before running off again. Alexander watched her with a mixture of awe and humility. He had spent decades believing he understood the measure of success. Stock prices, quarterly reports, skyscrapers built with his name etched in glass. But here, on a park bench with a recovering mother and her vibrant child, he discovered that success was quieter, simpler. It was this: presence. They found a spot beneath a sprawling oak tree where sunlight dappled the grass. Rachel spread a blanket while Alexander fetched hot dogs from a vendor. When he returned, Lily was drawing furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What's this masterpiece?" Alexander asked, sitting beside her. She held it up proudly. 3 stick figures stood hand in hand beneath a bright yellow sun. Above them, In shaky block letters, she had written, "Family is who shows up and never leaves." Rachel's breath caught. She turned to Alexander, her eyes shining. For weeks, she had battled with the question of whether this man, this billionaire, this stranger who had walked into their darkest night, would stay. Now, looking at Lily's drawing and the way Alexander held it as though it were more precious than any stock certificate, she knew the answer. "You stayed," she whispered. Alexander met her gaze, his voice steady. "I'm not leaving." As the day stretched on, they walked together through the park. Alexander lifted Lily onto his shoulders so she could see the performers playing violins near Bethesda Terrace. Rachel laughed, a sound so rare in her life that it startled her. She looked at Alexander, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine something more than survival. She allowed herself to imagine a future. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, painting the city in gold. They returned to the blanket, sitting close as the breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Lily leaned against her mother, eyelids heavy, but still clutching her sketch pad. "Will we always be together?" she murmured, her voice drowsy. Rachel smoothed her daughter's hair, her throat tightening. "Yes, baby, we will." Alexander added quietly, "Because family isn't just blood, it's who stands beside you, and I'll be here." Lily smiled faintly, then drifted into sleep, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the city's heartbeat. Weeks later, Lily's school hosted a writing showcase. Parents filled the small auditorium, clapping as children read essays about their heroes, firefighters, grandparents, teachers. When Lily's name was called, she walked to the microphone, her medal gleaming under the lights. Her essay was titled, "What Family Means to Me." "Family," she read, "isn't just who you're born with. Family is who shows up when the world feels dark. Family is someone who sits beside you in a hospital waiting room, who makes scrambled eggs even if they taste terrible, who tells you you're safe. Family is someone who doesn't leave, even when it's hard." She glanced toward the front row, where Rachel and Alexander sat side by side, hands almost but not quite touching. "Family is my mom, and it's also Mr. Hayes, because he showed up, and he never left." The room fell silent for a beat, then erupted into applause. Alexander lowered his head, overcome, while Rachel wiped her eyes, her pride overflowing. When Lily returned to her seat, she nestled between them. Rachel reached for Alexander's hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. She didn't see a CEO or a billionaire. She saw the man who had carried them out of shadows. And for Alexander, that single gesture, her hand slipping into his, felt like the most binding contract he had ever signed. That night, back at the apartment, they sat together by the window. Central Park stretched out below, the city glowing in twilight. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch, her sketchpad slipping from her fingers. Rachel turned to Alexander. "I don't have much to give. No wealth, no status, just myself and a daughter who means everything to me. Are you sure this is what you want?" Alexander looked at her, his voice thick with certainty. "Rachel, I've spent my life surrounded by everything money can buy. But what I've found with you and Lily, this money never could. Yes, it's what I want. It's what I need." Tears filled her eyes, but they were not born of fear this time. They were born of release. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she felt not just relief, but belonging. Spring deepened into summer. The three of them built a rhythm together. School mornings, therapy sessions, family dinners. The tabloids eventually tired of speculating, their cameras drifting elsewhere. What remained was quieter, but far more profound. One evening, as the sun set over Central Park, Alexander, Rachel, and Lily sat together on a park bench. The city around them pulsed with its usual chaos, but here, under the fading light, it was peaceful. Lily tugged at their hands, holding them both tightly. "See? Now we're a family chosen." Rachel kissed her daughter's forehead. Alexander squeezed her hand. And as the golden light washed over them, it felt true. They were no longer bound by circumstance, but by choice. And that, more than empire, more than survival, was the greatest fortune any of them could have imagined. And so, what began on a rainy Manhattan night outside the hospital ended beneath the gentle light of Central Park, where a billionaire, a mother, and her little girl discovered that true wealth is not measured in numbers, but in love that stays. Family is not only who we are born to, family is who shows up and never leaves. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us until the very end of this journey. Your presence here is what keeps these stories alive, what turns words into a shared fire of hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more healing journeys like this one. Because sometimes, the story you hear today is the courage someone else needs tomorrow.